All right, everyone, welcome to the 2023 AGM meeting for the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto. Good to see everyone here. I just wanted to briefly talk about an incident that happened in February when we visited Mill Creek Cave. And Hans and I have been organizing trips to Mill Creek in the winter for over 20 years now. And we've chosen to go in the winter because the water levels are lower in the cave and makes it easier to survey in the back part of the cave, in the wetter areas of the cave. And also it makes for an interesting trip to ski or snowshoe 5 miles back to the cave and then go through a pretty exciting cave, and then of course make our way 5 miles back to the trailhead. And this February we had a group of 10 people, and I think we had 3 or 4 people on snowshoes, and everyone else was on skis. 2 of the people were on just cross-country skis without any climbing skins or any assistance other than the fish scales on the skis. And on the way in, those 2 began sort of falling behind, so Hans had in his kit, he had some paracord. So I took the paracord back to Tristan and Dustin, who were a little bit behind us, and showed them how to wrap some P-cord around the base of the skis so that it would make it easier to travel along the trail. And I think that just sort of, it made it possible for them to get to the cave, but it was still a lot of work for all of us to get in there. And then of course we were in the cave for 3 or 4 hours, and we had decided that as we came out of the cave, everyone would wait at the cave entrance until everyone was out of the cave, which is significant because obviously if you had a situation develop inside the cave, it would be helpful to have everyone at the cave entrance and not already starting down the trail. In the past, often as people get back to the cave entrance, they put on their trail gear and just head off down the trail. So we'll end up with people spread out over several miles down the trail. And on this evening, it was probably 7:30 or 8 when we started leaving the cave. And everyone was sort of staying in small groups. Hans and I were sticking together. People on snowshoes had gone off down the trail. So we were getting spread out on the trail. And then Dustin and Tristan were the last 2 to leave the cave. And Hans and I got down to the sort of a steep hill just below the entrance of the cave, which is pretty demanding. Hans fell down a couple of times on his skis, and we made our way down to a large meadow that's probably a mile and a half from the cave. And there we met up with Hans's daughter, Heather, and her boyfriend, Miles. And the 4 of us waited for 15 or 20 minutes, hoping to see Dustin and Tristan's lights coming across the meadow. And we waited, like 15 or 20 minutes, and we still didn't see their lights. And so I said, well, I'll wait. I want to wait until I can see that they're on the trail and making their way out. And so Hans and his daughter and Miles left, and they started heading back towards the trailhead. And I waited where we had been for another 20, 30 minutes almost, until I was starting to get cold. And I left my pack there, and I skied back up the trail to make contact with Dustin and Tristan. And I found them about 3/4 of a mile up the trail. And Tristan was having a lot of difficulty. He was really exhausted. He had fallen down a number of times skiing down the steep hill below the cave entrance. And he was just completely wiped out. And so I took his pack, and then the 3 of us went back to where I left my pack, which was about 3/4 of a mile down the trail. And I think it took pretty much everything Tristan had to get even that far. And so we decided that really we needed to stop and let Tristan rest and build a fire. And probably the best thing to do was to initiate a rescue. And so Dustin got the fire going, and I had one of these little emergency blankets, Mylar blanket, which I've carried with me for years, keep it in my helmet or in my cave pack. And so I opened it up and gave it to Tristan to wrap up in. But I'll tell you, these things are pretty marginal. They don't stay wrapped around you. The wind can get into them. So it's better than nothing, but still, maybe not the best emergency blanket. But anyway, we set Tristan up with he had something to sit on. He had a fire going, and then they also had a stove along with them and a little coffee maker, like one of those small espresso makers. But Tristan was, just a small amount of a couple of shots of espresso weren't going to get him back on his feet. He needed to be fully rehydrated with warm liquids, and he wasn't going to recover in say 20 minutes and then sprint down the trail. So I left them at the fire and I skied out to the trailhead, where I met up with Brian Gindling was there, and Heather and Miles had also waited for us at the trailhead, but Hans and his students they headed back to town. And fortunately, I have friends at the trailhead who they're land managers for a larger landowner, and they, over the years, have given us access to cross their land in order to reach the cave, and that's been extremely helpful with our project. And fortunately, Lee Watson, who lives there, is a member of the Park County Search and Rescue. So we sort of knew I knew that we had a good contact. So we went down to the ranch and we woke up Lee and his wife Jeannie and said, hey, we have a situation and we're going to have some kind of rescue go on. And so Lee began, he called the sheriff, notified the sheriff's department, and then he also called up his search and rescue buddies who began arriving at the house, and it was decided that a helicopter extraction would be the best method to get Tristan out of there. So they rallied a helicopter out of Bozeman, life flight out of Bozeman, which flew over and located them, but it was a type of helicopter that it could land in the backcountry, but only if it was flat enough because of the rotors. And there was nowhere in the meadow that was flat enough for that helicopter to land. So they couldn't perform the extraction. So a second helicopter was requested out of Kalispell, a helicopter with a hoist. And that helicopter flew from Kalispell to Bozeman and then refueled at the airport in Bozeman, and then came and extracted Tristan from the backcountry, leaving Dustin with 2 packs full of gear, still in the backcountry. But while the helicopter's rescue was being organized, a ground team was also organized in case the second helicopter couldn't perform the extraction, so that there would be a group of people coming in on the ground if the helicopter couldn't work. And fortunately, they were able to pick Tristan up, and the ground team kept going in and met up with Dustin and helped him bring out the gear. And they took Tristan to the hospital in Livingston, where he was assessed. His core temperature was at about 95 degrees, which is getting pretty cold. You still maybe could rewarm yourself at 95, but anything below that, you're going to need assistance. And also he had some evidence, his blood work showed some evidence of muscle breakdown and also some evidence of heart stress. So he was in a pretty serious situation. I don't know if he would have been able to recover enough overnight to get himself out with even, with resting. And so we were very fortunate that they were able to pluck him out of the wilderness. And in the course of it, I decided that we did some things right, and then other things maybe we could have done a little better. And the thing we did correctly was everybody was keeping track of everyone else. So Dustin was going to stay with Tristan. They traveled together, so everybody was sort of keeping track. Heather and Miles are on Gallatin County Search and Rescue, and they had already gone down the trail. And I think that Miles had a much better emergency blanket with him, and it might have been worthwhile to have a better emergency blanket available. And the other thing that we had is Brian Gindling had a satellite rescue beacon with him, but unfortunately, he'd taken it down the trail with him, and so it was at the trailhead. So even if we didn't have the contact with the search and rescue right there at Lee and Jeannie's, we would have been able to initiate a rescue, but it might have taken several hours longer to get the rescue started. So now that everything is, now that we had some time to think about it, I was thinking first that it'd be better if everybody carried a more significant emergency blanket than just these little foil wraps, And there are some pretty substantial emergency blankets that are multiple layers. It's like it's a significant improvement on the old Mylar blankets, And the second thing is to have insulated water bottles. I noticed that Tristan's water bottles were on pockets on the side of his pack and had significant icing in them. So it's hard to stay hydrated, if your water is partly frozen. Drinking extremely cold water when you're already cold is not much help. And also on these longer trips into Mill Creek Cave or any cave where you're traveling in the winter, normally we think of the dangers in the cave, that that's the most significant place. If there was an accident, obviously the cave would be the worst place for it to happen. So when we do these trips to Mill Creek, we come out of the cave, and that's sort of, everyone breathes a sigh of relief, and then you go off down the trail, and it's tiring, but we haven't had a problem there. And so it was significant that we had a case of exhaustion and hypothermia on the way out of the cave. We were fortunate to have good weather so that it was possible for a helicopter to come in and do the extraction. If it had been cloudy, obviously we would have had to rely on a ground team to extract him. And I think the lesson is that hypothermia is probably the biggest danger that we face as outdoor enthusiasts. Once you stop moving in the backcountry, you're no longer producing muscle heat, and so if you're not producing muscle heat, you're going to have insulation, added layers, or a fire, or seek shelter, or something. And we were fortunate that, being February, although it was February, it wasn't terribly cold. It was calm weather, it was clear weather, and so we were lucky that the helicopters could operate. I think afterward, Tristan made a full recovery. He drove himself home 2 days later, So, and I don't think he's had any further trouble from it. But it was sort of a wake-up call for all of us. I think that the trouble is going to happen when you don't expect it. Which for us was, once you're out of the cave, you sort of think everything's going to be okay. But in this case, that's where the trouble started, and I think that Tristan became exhausted on the way in is what I'm thinking, and then the caving. He's an experienced caver, so the caving wasn't really that demanding for him. It was only a few hours of caving, really, but the 10 miles of travel over the snow is what exhausted him, and then once he was exhausted, of course he couldn't keep moving, so then he was no longer generating body heat, and then had this, like I say, a fairly lame tin foil blanket around him. It would have been better if we had a more substantial rescue package, I think. And maybe in future trips to Mill Creek Cave, we'll consider bringing a few more things, like a more significant hypothermia kit with us. And also, maybe it would be a good idea to stay more together as a group on the way out. Like on the way in, we stayed together pretty much as a group, but on the way out, everybody seems to spread out along the trail. And in the future, it might be better to stick together as a group. And also, if someone along on a trip has a rescue beacon, it would be a good idea if perhaps they could be the last person in line, if they could be running sweep, or you could appoint someone to be the last person down the trail, and then that person would have the emergency blanket and the satellite locator. Because in our case, the emergency blanket, the good emergency blanket and the satellite beacon had already headed down to the trailhead. And we, and the problem occurred with the last two people in line. So I think in the future, we'll try to do a better job of sticking together on the trail and sort of appointing a sweep to make sure that everyone makes it back down the trail. And I guess that's really all I had to say.